Well, let's start with a word of prayer and we'll jump in. Lord, thank you for the beauty of this day. We've all been just enjoying the wonder of it all. We pray that you would now open our hearts to hear the good news of your love for us in all things. Be with us now as we study and help us all to grow closer to you day by day. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So, the book of Judges. So what do you know about Judges before we... My sense is that this isn't like one of those books everybody rushes to. Oh, Book of Judges, let's go read that book. Do you know, what stories do you know that are in here? Few of the stories in here are a little more popular.
Refreshing. I don't remember.
Okay. There's some popular ones in here. Samson, Gideon is in the book of Judges. Those are probably the biggest. Others are less known throughout the book. So really, just to give you an introduction to the book so you can, it gives you something to hang things on. It's a collection of stories about heroes from the early days of God's people. So the setting of the book is it's between the Exodus event and Joshua taking over the land and the establishment of the monarchy. So this is between taking over the land and Saul being the first king of Israel. So we're in between the two of those. In the setting of the book probably was collected as a series of stories sometime during the exile. We'll talk about why it might have come together in the exile at one point, but probably they were stories that have been passed around as oral pieces for a long time, and were finally brought together at that particular time. One commentary compared these stories to stories from the frontier American West. So stories of like Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, Davy Crockett, people who were kind of like crazy people, but somehow took care of what needed to be taken care of at the time that they were there. The main message came to the exiles, I think, because first of all, you're in exile now and you go, oh, why did this happen to us? All this stuff. And the answer, basically, through a lot of the material that we find that comes from that period is, well, because you sinned. So here you are. You're here because you sinned. But the book of Judges kind of holds up. But even in the midst of our sin, God still hears us. So when we cry out, God hears God's people. God sends what we need in times of need, in these times when we're struggling, but in God's time and in somewhat unexpected packages sometimes. So we, and those people God sends sometimes are pretty imperfect too. They're not like these incredibly superhuman sort of people, but God uses who God chooses to use, whoever that happens to be. And so for the exiles, it was a way of saying it's time to pray now. And trust that God's going to send what we need to have sent to us in this particular time. So what kind of message might that have for us today?
Never give up.
Okay. First of all, when we're tempted to give up, there's this great sort of sense of don't give up. God still hears you. Anything else people might?
Well, even when we're living the life that we shouldn't be living, or that we're struggling through the life that we have, that God's still there when we reach out. He's still trying to guide us, even if we're not taking it.
Right. Our failures don't separate us from God. There's always the opportunity to turn back, find God there for us.
Sometimes I think it's not what I hope for and think should be happen, but God has a better way, and it usually works out better.
Okay. God works in ways we don't expect we may not even want. But that's God for you. God makes the choices, and we receive the gifts as they come to us. Well, let's start with then the first chapter. What I'll do is I'll read for you chapter 1 through chapter 210, because this is like an opening sort of introduction to the book in it. And then we'll do a little unpacking of what's there. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up.
Sure, that's not
Okay.
I hear a honking. It's down here though. I'm right on the corner here.
Oh, okay. Oh, not you.
Oh,
Stop.
Okay. I got that all the time, and I don't know what to do about it. Sorry. Thank
That's
you.
okay. The Lord said, Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand. Judah said to his brother Simeon, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went up with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They came upon Adonai-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table as I have done, so God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterwards, the people of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kirath Araba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ammon and Talmai. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Debir, which was formerly Kireth Sephar. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kireth Sephar and takes it, I will give him my daughter Aksha as wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave him his daughter Aska as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey. Caleb said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, give me a present. Since you have set me in the land of the Negeb, give me also Galath Mayam. So Caleb gave up the upper Galath and the lower Galath. The descendants of Habab, the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms and into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. Then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Homa. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Askelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, so the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you. So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblaim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not in fact drive them out. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Naal. But the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, or Halba, or Afik, or Rahab. But the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shean and Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They didn't allow them to come down into the plain. The Amorites continued to live in Harheres and Aijalon and Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bachim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land, tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voice and wept. So they named that place Bachim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites all went to their own inheritance, take possession of the land. People worshiped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the Mount Gasha, or Gash. Moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. So, what's important in this section?
Can you tell me, where did Joshua come from?
Joshua was part of the Exodus group that came out from Egypt. And so Joshua, when Moses died, took over as the leader. And so he's the one in the book of Joshua, if you go back one book, who leads the people into the promised land and leads kind of the military takeover of the promised land. So that's what Joshua's role was. And so we come to this point where now Joshua has left. And there's no kind of unifying sort of force within Israel at this point. So each tribe is kind of on its own. Other than, they make, like we began the chapter, Judah said, well, house of Simeon, why don't you come help me do this? And then I'll help you do that. And so those two houses work together to secure their own lands. But for the most part, everybody has kind of broken up into their separate little groupings and control certain lands. So that's kind of the setting for the book then. Joshua's died now, and the generation that kind of came with Joshua into the promised land, they're all gone. So now this is their kids who are getting ready to take over.
It seems like they're fighting all the time. They're not happy with one another.
Well, not so much with one another, because the people they talk about that they're fighting against are actually tribes within the land of Canaan. So what's happened is the Jews have come in. It's interesting. A lot of scholars hold up, and again, I'm not sure exactly. Some people see that the whole book of Joshua takes place first, and then this book, Judges, kind of is the, comes afterwards. So now Joshua's gone and things are kind of collapsing, and, there's problems that go on after that. Other people say that what Judges is really an alternative understanding of how the land was taken over. So Joshua has this image of, okay, they all marched in, they're going to beat everybody up, they pushed them out, and so now the land's theirs. This image is more that, it wasn't all at once sort of thing. They pushed somebody back, and then they came back and fought against them and pushed the Israelites back. And so there's this constant shifting sort of reality that takes place in the tribes. A lot of people see this particular book as part of what's called the Deuteronomic tradition. So the center of that is the book of Deuteronomy. If you go and look at the book of Deuteronomy, it kind of gives you the very sense of what the center of that is about. And the underlying understanding of the Deuteronomic tradition is, if you're good, you get rewards. If you're bad, you get punished. That's it has this kind of overall simple equation about how life works. If you're faithful, then everything will be okay. If you're not, then things are going to be bad. Within the scriptures, there are some counter thoughts about that. Like if you read the book of Job, it says, well, it's not really the way. Good people have really terrible things happen. People who are bad have really good things happen. So somehow this Deuteronomic thing is all too simple. But at least that's what, the people who wrote Deuteronomy and probably Judges too, had as the center of their thinking pattern that, good's rewarded, bad's punished. And that also within the Deuteronomic tradition, what's seen as the high point of Israel's history is David's kingship. So David is kind of, when David's king, that's it. This is the pinnacle of where we were. And then after that, everything kind of slides. So it's not strange that coming from that tradition, the book of Judges would start with Judah being the one who goes out and seems to be the one who really goes and takes charge, because that's the tribe David came from. So here is the Judites are the ones who go out and kind of grab hold of things, make things happen. The others are a little less successful than them.
So I find this portion here kind of in contrast with how I think of God for me, because they were taken from slavery and then, went into the desert, and then they were exiled out because of what happened. And they're wandering the land, and they have this promise of what will be. And they're going in and murdering and killing and making slaves of everybody.
Yeah.
And I understand that these are idol worshipers and things like that, but it's like they're just ravishing the land. But are they doing that with God's grace and permission? And I mean, I don't know. I struggle with that.
Yeah. What do other people think in the midst of that?
Well, the Old Testament is really a lot different than the New, when Jesus comes and love your neighbor, love yourself, take care. And here it's just unbelievable, some of the things they did. And I've been in other long-term Bible studies where that Old Testament was tough to take because of what was going on. But it's all leading up to Christ, if you look at it.
But it sure is tough on the people that are living there.
During this particular time. Sure. And until the Roman peace, the Pax Romana came along, where they squelched all these little wars.
Yep. Not much of a peace, though. It was mainly peace by
Roman
military power.
They kept the skirmishes down. And that, that helped somewhat too, but.
So at this point, we have the 12 different tribes, and they're coming in, and they're really divided. I mean, they're all obviously God's children, but they're all divided. They're squabbling among each other, or at least they're all going in to claim what they believe is their portion of the inheritance.
Yeah, and according to Joshua, the inheritance has been split up, so they know what's their portion is supposed to be. So what they're doing is this, going in and occupying what's supposed to be their land. From the perspective of the writer of this book, and I have to admit, just like all of you, I have difficulties with, warring and killing. But one of the aspects I think we have to struggle with and ask ourselves the question is, if God is going to give this land to these people, that's their understanding of reality, that God is with them and God's going to give them this promised land. Well, what do you think is going to happen to the people who are there? They're not going to say, come on in. We want you to join us in this land. That's not the way the world works. And so really the only option within this with structure is that God promises to be with them as they go in and take over the land and occupy the land. Now, there's a problem, though, from the perspective of the person who writes this book with how they did it. And what is it?
I don't know what you're asking.
Is it that they didn't drive out?
They didn't drive everybody out.
There.
They kept them there. And so from the perspective of this book and later understandings that we find throughout the Old Testament, the problem is if you don't do that, then you've got all these people around you who have different gods, they have different ways of thinking, and they're constantly going to be this influence that starts to weather away your faith in God.
Which is kind of verse 10 shows what happens. That age
dies out.
And
they forget, the children forget the history, which is, again, the whole, really, if you read the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books, which is all set during the Exodus event, they're constantly told, okay, remind your children of what's happening so that they don't forget what's going on. Well, obviously that hasn't happened. The children grow up. They don't really have much of a understanding of what went on before. And so all these influences are out there then, and they all kind of, okay, maybe we ought to worship their gods. Their gods seem pretty good to us. Maybe they made sacrifices to Baal or something, and rain came and they said, look, it works. And so they said, well, maybe we should worship them. So the problem is that, God had warned them, if you don't push these people out, they're going to be there. They're going to be this kind of influence that you are constantly going to be pulling you away from the faith. But that, except it seems in the case of Judah, who goes in and lays the hammer down, all the other ones kind of like, well, we don't want to push too hard. Some aren't very successful at all. The Danites end up being kept up in the hill country because they can't defeat the people who are there at all. So the book is saying, though, that ultimately the failures that are to come are from their inability to separate themselves from other peoples. That's also the kind of understanding you'll find in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. But counter to that will be the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, some of the other books which say, well, but we're called to be a blessing to the world. And if all we do is cut ourselves off, then how do we carry on that reality?
Was there any chance of having ones that they did occupy, have the existing people convert?
Sure. People could have converted to Judaism, but probably a lot of them wouldn't. Think about how well the Crusades went. That was just and they were saying convert or die. And still people said, well, no. What's going to be the impetus for people to convert, really? Especially when these people have just come in and take over your land, it's probably not going to be.
It sounds like during this portion, regardless of how this is happening, this is God's will that you stay separate at this time.
Yep.
That you go in and take the land.
Yep.
And you do not engage with the others that are there.
And maybe there's a sense of they're just too young in the faith. They haven't had years of being faithful or whatever. And so they're not quite ready. The mind of God is hard to read in these stories. Instead, what you get is the understanding of the people who wrote the stories, which was that part of the problem was that they mixed in with all these other people and began to take on their customs. And in the process, they lost their connection to God. And so what this leads to then is the pattern you will see throughout this book. There's one pattern that flows throughout this book. You'll see it over and over again, that the people fall away from God. Difficulties happen. They get conquered or pushed around by some other force that's out there. And so they cry out to God, God, come and help us. Finally, they turn back to Yahweh and they say, help us. And Yahweh sends somebody to help them out. And then for a while, things go really spiffy and everybody's, on the same track. And then again, they fall away from God. Things go off the tracks.
Very much like today's world.
Yeah.
Like the each
It's
of
for
us
your
maybe.
feet itself, right?
The interesting question I had, and we don't have to answer it now, but just to think about in the back of your hand. This book seems to say that all the difficulties arise because of our disobedience to God. Is that really why all the difficulties are out there? And does God ever, declare that these difficulties are, I'm going to make this happen so that they get the message, which sometimes it appears that way in the book of Judges, or maybe just says, well, I'm just going to take my hand off the till, let things happen as they happen, and then when they need help, they'll call me back. Is that how it works? All those things are difficult understandings for me of how God would work. But that certainly is how it's seen within the structures of the book of Judges. So later on, as we go along, we can talk about, well, how do we feel about that? So then we finally, we've had this introduction. We know how they got there. We know what's happening. And now we really get into the sense of what happens in the book of Judges. So we're going to look at 2:11 through 3:6 is the next kind of little section of this. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baal. So they joined in with the cultural people around them. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Ashtaroths, which are kind of female versions of Baal. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring them misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, but obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant, that I commanded their ancestors, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. In order to test Israel, whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did, the Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that the successive generations of Israel's might know war, to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath, they were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. So, what strikes you in that section?
Incest.
Well, it's not incestuous. It just says they, all these cultures surrounded them, and they said, well, you can marry our daughters, and we'll marry your daughters, and we'll kind of intermix our cultures together. Though it sounds like they ended up taking on more of the cultures of the people who were around them than people of the cultures took on their culture.
They kind of gave up, didn't they? By letting this happen.
Yeah, they decided, hey, there are some good things about these people around us, so let's take on their customs because it seems to get us what we want. So we'll take on their,
Maybe seeing this more from a parenting perspective, and that's just because I have so many kids at home. It seems to me like God is much more hands-on with them at the beginning. This is a yes and a no, and this is what you'll do, and this is this, and this is how it's going to be. But then he says, I'll leave them among you so that you can now figure this part out yourself. Not that they do. It seems to me like he's much more hands-on when they start out on this journey.
Yeah.
And now it's not that he's not intervening anymore.
Yeah.
At least not a hands-on intervening every moment.
Yeah.
Tough love.
Tough love.
Yeah. Kind of.
Feels like they draw away from God and kind of forget about him. God punishes them or sends a judge who gets them on the right track, and then they're good, and then they forget, and
Yep.
what happens?
Back and forth. Yeah, the pattern is people fall away, trouble comes, God withdraws, and stands against. Even the part that is always interesting to me is actually stands against them. It says, whenever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them, so they couldn't win. Then they cry out finally, and God sends a judge to free the people. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. This is the way it works throughout the whole thing. So how do you respond? I guess one of the first things is, none of these have right or wrong answers. So don't look to me to give you the answers to these because I don't got them. But how do you respond to the idea of God testing the Israelites? So I'm going to leave these people here and see how well you do. So it's one thing to say, well, at some point you have to let your kids go and they have to work it out themselves. It's another thing to say, I'm going to put a bottle of alcohol on the table and see whether they go and drink. So
Almost testing their faith. Do they know enough now that they're going to do the right thing?
obviously not.
Found that out later.
And obviously we still haven't figured it out because we still do. I mean, think about it. We are just as tempted to follow the dominant culture, to all the places that it calls us to go, to give up our allegiance to God when it looks like we'll get ahead in the world if we do such and such.
It's like God is, I think, seems God doesn't change, but we pull away or finally come to our senses and go back to God, and then we have that peace. Things may not have changed at all, but that inner change is there.
Well, and ultimately that's the part that we sometimes, we hear that God gave them these commandments and they didn't follow them. But the point was, if you read carefully through the first 5 books of the Bible, the idea is the commandments aren't so, okay, we'll look good and God won't beat us up. The commandments are, if you follow the commandments, you follow them out of devotion to God. You love God, and that's why you do these things. Not you don't do them so God will love you. You already know God loves you and you love God, and that's why you follow the commandments. So obviously what's happening is that Israel is losing its connection to the relationship. It's not just that they're not following God or whatever, but their relationship is foundering. So they form relationships with other gods. And those become their primary relationship. No longer is God their primary relationship, but their connection to Baal or Ashtaroth or the wealth that some culture can give them or whatever. What I always struggle with, and I think that that's true, we do get caught up in culture, we have things, but what kind of drives the wedge in the church these days is we all define what that dominant culture is differently. So I would say that giving into the dominant culture means that what you do is you give into the idea that power and wealth are the big things. You use those to get whatever you want. You think that the way that you can make things happen is by following the very tools that the culture uses. That's what I call the dominant culture. Where other people would say the dominant culture is when you give into things like abortion or LGBTQIA plus stuff. You're giving into what the dominant culture thinks rather than God thinks. So part of the struggle we have is defining what that dominant culture really is that God calls us away from. And that can only happen as we live in close relationship with God. So I think my understanding of the culture that I try to resist comes from living in relationship with God. And when that relationship breaks down, then you really have no guidance as to what dominant culture is versus God. You end up following whatever. And one of the last verses of the book of Judges is, see if I can find it real quick, kind of says it all, what finally ends up when our close relationship with God breaks down. And let's see. It's the very last verse, 21-25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Ultimately, that's what it all breaks down into then, is just everybody kind of goes off in their own direction. And there's no guiding force that unifies your understanding of what life is all about. But again, we're back to that, what should be the unifying reality? And we have, we walk with God in different ways. And so that sometimes leads us to see the unifying reality in different ways. The other important thing I think to think about is here's a God, according to the book of Judges, that forgives over and over and over and over and over again. So that says a lot to us too. We have this God who, no matter how messed up we get, still is there waiting around to guide us, to keep us, to help us. And that also says something about how do we forgive other people then? That's the whole point in the Lord's Prayer when we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It should guide us in how we think about those things as well. So now we're going to get into some of the specific judges in the book of Judges. What you have now is a series of stories about individual judges who come in. And there's kind of a progression that I want you to kind of think about as we go. Think about how do these judges change as we go further and further in the story. How do you think about each of the judges? So we start at 3:7. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God, worshiping Baals and Ashtaroth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Haram. And the Israelites served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites who delivered them. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan Risharam of Aram into his hands, and his hand prevailed over Cush Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So, what do you hear?
One of the books I read was called Eat the Rich.
Mm-hmm.
And the man was looking for what makes a country good.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought it was wealth. Mm-hmm. That was his,
right.
But it wasn't. It was a court system and it was a government. And even in the Scandinavian countries that don't have, are different. Even they were better. So it wasn't wealth at all. And I think that just here, he started with a judge and he began to have a systematic, not court system, but stability. And that's what's missing.
So Othniel provides this stability to the people that are there. He becomes kind of the central sort of linchpin around things.
Yeah.
So what do you think of Othniel? This is the first of the judges were introduced. We don't get a lot of information about Othniel as compared to some of the others we're going to get to later. But what do you think of him?
Sounds like his first thing was to go to war.
Yeah,
yep.
I was thinking that.
So he's a warrior. He's a hero. He's kind of a stand-up sort of guy that, God puts in place. We don't really get anything negative or bad about him in this particular story of Othniel.
Doesn't sound like he seeks war, though, because he has 40 years of peace after that.
40 years of peace after that, and rest for the land. So he seems like kind of the leader we'd like to have. If we could have a leader, that was how does he compare to like the leaders we've got
today? Was it compared to today?
Yeah.
You're getting in a whole different area.
Well, he had 40 years of
rest and
so
peace.
We don't have that. It seems to me he was, after he got rid of the Mesopotamians, then he brought rest to Israel, for lack of a better word, Israel.
He's calmed everything down.
Yeah, so it was good.
Here are people now.
And if they didn't, once he died, that was it. Then they're back to their old
ways. Yep. Lose the leader and things just go down the tube. So compare, as we go along, think about comparing all these different kinds of judges. This is the next judge we come to. Actually, it's one of my favorite of the judges' stories because there's biting humor in it and all kinds of things that are part of this. But the Israelites, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. An alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool rooftop chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglin's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, must be relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculpted stones and escaped to Serah. When they arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they killed about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. No one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel.
The time of peace was a lot longer.
Now, I should break this story down for you, because in English, this does not quite give you the idea of what this story is about. So we have Ehud. He's left-handed.
Mm-hmm.
So he straps this kind of daggery sort of thing that he made into the inside of his right thigh. Now, the guards would be used to right-handed people. So they would check where a right-handed person would normally put a weapon, not be so clear of where a left-handed person would. So he manages to slip in. Then he tells the king, I have a message for you. So the king sends away all of his attendants and stuff. And now you should know that when they mention, let's see, what's it called in the passage? Let's see. So Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber, which is the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, oh, king, I have a message for you. The king stands up, stabs the dagger in. So the fat closes over it, so you don't even see the dagger anymore. So nobody quite would know what would happen. It says, then all the dirt went on the floor. In essence, the king.
Yes, okay, got it.
He closes and locks the bathroom door, and then slips out through the cesspool underneath the toilet and wanders out through the sewers, so that the people all come in and they open the door and the king's dead.
They don't see the sword.
They don't see the sword. They don't see anybody else in the bathroom. The original locked door mystery here. Nobody knows what happened to the king. Things are now in chaos because Ehud has kind of committed this assassination. And so he gets back out and he whips up the troops while, the structures of leadership in the kingdom are falling apart, and they wipe out the Moabites and manage to take over. So, and there's all kinds of little interesting things in here. Eglon, the king, that word means calf or bull. So he's, that's the image of Baal. So here's God defeating Baal kind of in this image as well. Also, left-handed people, we talk about the left hand as being dirty, sneaky. Why do we do that? Because
different.
In the olden days, when you have no toilet paper, you wipe yourself your left hand. and wash it out. Why do you think people shake with their writing? So, there's kind of this, so God chooses this sort of sneaky assassin now to go in and take out the king and free the Israelites. So one of the things that in one of the kind of commentaries on this had as a question, I think is a really interesting question, because again, I'm not sure this is what Judges is saying, but you can certainly sometimes wonder about these realities. Do we believe that a negative action done for good reasons is a good thing? Normally, we wouldn't say assassination was probably among the most noble of actions. Think about in our own world, suicide bombers and political assassinations are not looked on as positive things. And yet here we have this story of this guy who sneaks in, knocks off the king so that they can take over. And it seems like, well, okay. So we start out with Othniel, who is like this stand-up, wonderful sort of guy, and the next guy is a sneaky assassin who manages to get the people free by taking out the king in a rather clever sort of plot to finish him off. And you might see as we go along that more and more the judges become less and less people you would go, yeah, those are really heroic sort of, no, some of them are. Until we get to the last judge, who is a selfish, self-centered. Hi,
everybody.
Hello.
Oh.
Good to see you.
We just came here. She says you're down there. You can see them.
Hi, Carl.
Good to see you.
Hi, Beth.
Good to see you both. So we'll pick it up there next week with the next judge. The only woman judge in the bunch.
Oh, she'll be the best.